Rich und Ehre, war sich der noch angesäche. So bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab. Hier ließ sich reine taufen, dass der Mensch.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Matt Pegas,
And this is Dan Baltic.
and we're here today with 0HP Lovecraft. He is a writer who needs no introduction, a Twitter thread maestro, sort of the uncrowned king of frog Twitter, I would say. Now that I don't know if that's a title he would take upon himself, but now that at Bronze Age Mantis has fallen, zero
Or
HP
ascended.
Perhaps 0HP is pretty much at the top of the game for Frog Twitter. But more importantly, and why we have him on today, is that he is a writer. He wrote the Gig Economy. You've been writing for 3-4 years now, Zero, starting with Gig Economy back in 2018. Famously wrote God-Shaped Hole. More recently, Don't Make Me Think. You are an experimenter with different forms and different, incorporating different elements into your work. Don't Make Me Think famously utilizes emojis extensively. God-Shaped Hole has these labyrinthine footnotes and links. Gig Economy incorporates a lot of screenshots from Twitter and 4chan. I just say this in case any of our listeners are not familiar with your writing, to give them an idea that you are, basically what would you say, science fiction and horror writer, and as well as an experimenter with the medium?
I would say that's an accurate characterization of my work. I'm always looking for new ways to use the digital and the internet and the web formats, because I think it's actually very hard to do. It's hard to do something that feels native to the web, that kind of delinearizes it and actually makes use of all these tools. And I think we've only really scratched the surface of that. You get video games, which are sort of leaning towards a fully immersive narrative experience, but they become too caught up in all of the little loops and contrivances of the video game itself. They become too much game, not enough story. But then when you look at the experimental games that focus on story, they're also very lacking, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. It's something I really appreciate about your writing, is that you're trying to kind of push the medium forward into new territory. And traditional stories that don't experiment are all well and good, but there's something about, the fact that we're all very online. You're a very online writer, famous kind of first as a Twitter user. So it's interesting to see that rather than having fiction be some kind of space outside of that, it seems that you're both in terms of, again, the medium and the elements you incorporate, but also very much in terms of plot and the themes you deal with. You're always allowing this digital world we inhabit to enmesh your stories, and you confront both the problems and also just kind of the silly little things that being online means constantly in your work. And I think it's one of the things that gives it a lot of value and will, it will make it something that I do think people will read in the future, because it tackles the issues and just the fabric of its time in an interesting way.
That's absolutely my intention. I've been thinking a lot lately, about what to write next. So some viewers may be familiar with the Passage Prize, which I think was kind of a big event earlier this year. And that was a very educational experience for me. And I think I've commented on it, I've talked about it a little bit elsewhere. But in some ways, I'm still processing like what that meant. It's very there's so much data there. I literally read over 400 stories of by other people in this space, and in some cases, and I don't mean to sound like, some people may think this sounds arrogant, and I don't mean it that way, but many of these writers actually look up to me in some sense, I think, and that's quite apparent when you read what themes they choose and what narrative devices they choose and so on.
Right.
And so seeing that reflection almost, not just of my work, but how those ideas are present in like the larger culture of frog Twitter, it gives me a lot of pause, and it makes me think about, in a sense, what's left to say on some of these themes, because like we all get it. The internet depersonalizes you and derealizes you, and it enables these sort of strange forms of mob tyranny to start to pull you this way and that. And you become a very, very moralistic, but also performatively moralistic person. So, you can kind of endlessly walk back and forth in that rut of like, okay, I find this digital niche, bacteria grow there in the form of these like moralistic mobs, and then they crucify me. And that's a story that happens a billion times. We see it every 3 days on Twitter, and I think people are aware of that problem. Tucker Carlson is aware of that problem at this point. Most normie-cons, anyone watching Fox News knows that. Do we need to shine another light on that? I'm not saying don't, but to me, I'd like to move on a little.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't read, obviously, all of those Passage Prize submissions, but it was on our list of questions to ask you today, what that experience was like, because you've probably, on this pod, we talk about cultivating, the literary scene that we're part of in our corner of Twitter, and I think with really beyond a shadow of a doubt, you have read more work from this corner of Twitter now post Passage Prize than anyone, probably like 10 or 20 times over, which gives you, pretty unique insight into, what our guys are thinking about, so to speak. And, what are the themes that they keep coming back to? And you've already answered the question, which is basically this theme of the internet and the potential evil lurking in the internet, was very much the focus on a lot of the submissions.
I would say so. I mean, I sort of mentally put them in a few different categories because there was a lot of that. There was a lot of kind of what I call pod life stories or eat the bug stories.
Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't even that many. I think if you the numerator of that was probably on the order of 30 or 40 out of 400. So it's less than 10%. But it's still probably the single largest category of the submissions also that are even really worth dwelling on. Like a lot of people tried, and I respect them for trying, and I think everyone accomplished something just by like putting something on paper, going through the motion of submitting. That is it can be personally a big deal, even if the work itself is not a big deal, if that makes sense. And yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I wrote a novel that not a ton of people have read, but like I think definitely getting the work out there as kind of lib and psychiatric or psychological counselor as it might sound, I think that there is something very therapeutic and good about just writing. So I definitely don't think I think it's good. I think it's a really great sign that so many people submitted stories, even if most of them aren't going to make it into the the final work, it's a sign of health in a way for our scene that there's this many people who want to write creatively. But yeah, I'm not surprised that pod living was kind of a recurring theme. Dan and I had to ask you, do you think? I mean, is that could just be partially the after effects of COVID, right, or the lockdowns? Maybe that's just kind of what's on people's mind.
Yeah, COVID made pod life very salient to a lot of people. I think that's absolutely true. But it's also just like a very obvious projection. Like, you see all these things going on, whether it's the completely astroturfed media blitz to try to get people to eat more insects. Now, I don't know, you've probably seen it, the current thing is that all of these food processing plants are being burned, arson. There was a plane crash into one, boiler explosion. Just far too many to be coincidence. This has happened in the last few days. This is like
I just tweeted about that, actually. I said the seed oil revolution is upon us because they crashed into General Mills.
Is someone trying to start a food shortage, or is this actually like anti-xenoestrogen activism? I sort of hope it's not, but maybe it's based to destroy a potato chip factory. Please do not commit any violence to anyone who listens to me, ever.
Yeah. Yeah, no, well, I think any scene is going to have their recurring themes, and the same way that if you had some woke writing competition, I'm pretty sure probably more than 10% of the stories would be these kind of identity-laden, here is my trauma, this is why it's Whitey's fault type stories.
Look at the young adult novels, and it's like, we almost couldn't parody the things that they're publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's so many criticisms one could make of woke stuff, but honestly, one of them that even transcends merely political concerns is that it's incredibly repetitive, and the whole economy and that creative field has been created around like sort of pimping out your trauma and your trauma porn and identity porn, basically. So compared to that, if we have about 10% of submissions to Passage Prize were about the same sort of speculative pod living scenario, we're not doing too badly if that's 10%. Plus, I'm sure a lot of those stories, as repetitive as maybe they would get after a while, I'm sure a lot of them are good as well. So
yeah, I think a lot of people also wrote, and this was across every category of story that I saw. Many people they're really writing television scripts or movie scripts. And I don't necessarily discourage this. Like, there's a place for that, and I think it'd be amazing to see more of our guys having an influence and a presence in film. But it's just it's so much bigger and more expensive and more complicated, and none of it can be done anonymously. It's very hard to make a film anonymously, basically impossible.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So you see a lot of that. A lot of people who I think they're more comfortable or more inclined towards like the medium of television or movies. And to me, this is always a little bit of a mismatch for a writing competition, but that's also my own like pretension as someone who's more interested in the literary.
No, I hear you. I mean, I'm someone who's delved in both like screenwriting and novelistic writing, or not novel, you know what I mean, prose writing. And yeah, I do think there is a significant difference. I think both are good forms of writing, but I do think there's a kind of stripped down screenwriting style that can really showcase a person's imagination and perhaps even their visual imagination. But I think like the type of writing that you do, for example, is very much a cut above that, because you create. You specifically, because your work is in this kind of Borgesian or obviously Lovecraftian, which we'll get into, space where it very much sort of opens up these whole world. It like creates its own mythos and opens up these vast. The word that always comes to me, as with Borges, is labyrinthine. You create these worlds, which is very much a feat of a certain kind of prose writing. There's stuff you can do with prose writing that you can't do, obviously, when you're just kind of dictating like a movie you're seeing in your head, so to speak.
Well, I think crucially with prose writing, you have potentially complete control over the manuscript. You have complete control over that world. Whereas with screenwriting, you are writing something that a director is going to take, is going to cut from, is going to adapt, and the actors will interpret the lines as well. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've written a novel also, and why I love prose writing is you're the god when you are writing prose.
True. Yeah.
You know, you hear people say, become ungovernable. This is a meme you see all the time. And I think as a writer, my goal is to become unfilmable. I want things to possibly be captured in that medium.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think it's always an interesting question with any writer, I think. What would the 0HP Lovecraft movie look like? And I think it's basically unfilmable. I think my initial thought would be, I mean, there's a reason there's never been like a Voorhees or even real, I mean, there's the reason there's never been a Voorhees movie. There's never been a good Lovecraft interpretation on film, I don't think. They made a show called Lovecraft Country, which seemed woke and horrific. I don't know if you saw that. I didn't see it myself. Anyhow.
But you know, there is one Lovecraft movie which I think is almost perfectly true to his vision, ironically, because it has nothing in common with the original text. And this is a movie made in 1985 called Reanimator. So this movie is based, well, actually, it's really not based. It's very, very loosely based on Herbert West, Reanimator. And it's a fairly typical Lovecraft story about a man who's using science. It's really more of a science fiction story, and he's injecting corpses with various concoctions to bring them back to life. And the story is measured, and it's not really bombastic at all. And they turned it into just an 80s camp film going with that premise, with like singing, dancing skeletons and Euro disco. And although it has nothing in common with like the cosmic horror of Lovecraft, my cosmic horror when I watched this movie almost perfectly captured the emotion.
Yeah. I think that's what it'd have to be, is kind of some sort of outside the box encapsulation of the spirit of Lovecraft's work or of your work, because textually you're not going to capture that on camera. That would be interesting to see someone try, but
actually a more serious answer to that question is you've probably seen John Carpenter's The Thing in 1982. Now, that is a true Lovecraftian story, despite not being written by Lovecraft.
Sure.
But it deals very much with the themes of the outside, something that really can't be quite articulated or comprehended by human intellect. So I think that gets better closer than anything that's based on his work. And bonus, there are no women in this movie.
That's
always a good sign. Event Horizon, also very Lovecraftian. I enjoyed that one quite a bit.
Yeah, I heard you, I think on a different podcast, maybe Aaron McIntyre, describe that as pretty. And I know that you've often said that you're not the connoisseur of horror that some might think you are, but you obviously do have some thoughts. And I heard you say that kind of horror that you just described as being contained in John Carpenter's The Thing, and by extension also Lovecraftian horror, is a sort of right-wing horror because it deals so squarely with the notion of something from the outside. And in the case of Lovecraft, in the case of The Thing, it's something very much outside, perhaps even something from another dimension, as is also the case in your work. It deals with something outside. You know, the fear comes from something outside coming in, something invading. You've described that as a certain right-wing horror, so to speak. I guess I'm just asking if that resonates, and if that's kind of one of the reasons you identify with Lovecraft as both a horror writer and as a right-winger.
Yes, I mean, so I really, and I've told people this before, I really did pick this name as a joke. Like, it's a funny before and after, right? He's Lovecraft, but with 0 hit points. That's really the idea.
Yeah.
And people sort of imagine that, oh, you named yourself after Lovecraft, you must be some like deep aficionado of his work. I really like Lovecraft stories. I've read most of them, I think, and a few of his letters. But I know 3 or 4 people who've gone way deeper on that.
Yeah, he's one of those writers that he's one of those writers that it seems like there's always a bigger aficionado out there somewhere. There's always someone who's read all the letters.
I do really admire his mysticism.
Absolutely.
I think he kept a dream journal, which isn't that uncommon to do, but he kept a dream journal, and he would always try to draw from his dreams and the things he'd seen in his stories. So some of his stories are very short, and many of them do have this dreamlike affect where you can tell he saw this in his sleep, and he was very sort of in tune with those imageries. I have been taking a lot of glycine lately, which gives me very vivid dreams. But I'm looking for those
useful.
Lovecraftian moments, and I don't think I'm doing a good job of finding them yet.
Yeah, I can imagine it's a bit of a spirit quest and a challenge. This was not on our outline, but I just thought of it now in how you were describing Lovecraft. I'm not sure if you've I mean, you probably have, because you've spoken a lot in a lot of places about a lot of things. But are you a David Lynch fan?
A little bit. I can't say that I've seen all of his movies, and some of them don't maybe resonate with me quite as much. Not that I dislike them. I am a huge fan of Blue Velvet. I think that's one of my favorite movies that I've ever seen. And the character played by Dennis Hopper, just an incredibly memorable villain. So I really like that quite a bit.
For sure. Yeah. No, I just brought Lynch up. It's funny, we were just talking about Dennis Hopper on our last episode with Howling Mutant, so a little synchronicity there. But yeah, I just bring it up because I think Lynch also falls into that category of someone who kind of starts from a place of mysticism or even literally his own dreams and lays them out. But on that note, I definitely wanted to ask, I have a number of sort of maybe philosophic's the wrong word, a number of sort of headier questions dealing with mysticism to some extent that I wanted to ask. One thing that I really struck me kind of reading and rereading your work in prep for the conversation today, and I know you've talked about this elsewhere, is both that you're influenced by Lovecraft, but perhaps even more strongly influenced by Borges. I reread The Gig Economy in prep for today's episode and was really struck. You've said that the structure of that story is sort of like the Call of Cthulhu, the Lovecraft story, and that you have a protagonist who begins to slowly research a topic and slowly but surely finds that there's some broader conspiracy behind it, and then there's a somewhat horrifying conclusion. That's all very Lovecraftian. But then the part in the middle, which obviously ties in with the end as well, where the protagonist basically uncovers this old book which predicts the gig economy that the story is about, the day job. People who haven't read the story should, but basically the story is about people who complete these inscrutable, bizarre, neat type people who complete these strange tasks through like an app or through Reddit or something, where they're earning little bits of money to do inscrutable tasks. And then in the gig economy, your protagonist finds that there's this ancient book which sort of predicted the economy that would later build up around this very online economic reality. That is all very... The book element struck me as being straight out of Borges and straight out of the Tlon Uqbar story. So I guess the question I had in mind, or I guess more of a comment, is that you sort of thread the needle between Borges and Lovecraft very well. I don't know how often they've been written about in the same sentence as being similar, but to me, my impression, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. My impression is that Voorhees and Lovecraft have quite a bit in common, in that even though one is a horror writer and one is a writer of a much more, I don't even know how you describe Voorhees, but he's not a horror writer. He's more neutral in what he presents. He's not trying to scare us per se.
He's philosophical.
I think
he's very metaphysical. With Borges, he talks
definitely
a little bit in a few places of what he calls a sacred terror. So a sacred terror is the fear of God in a way, not the fear. Now, the fear of God, that's an interesting phrase. When we talk about the fear of God, we don't mean a visceral, like horror movie horror, right? It's not the fear that you feel when your life is threatened by a monster or a serial killer or something like that. The fear of God is a very slow and subtle and all-pervading fear. It's the fear that you feel when you walk into maybe a giant cathedral and you hear the echoes and you see the ceiling is so far away, and this sense of space arrests you and gives you a sense of transport. And that is in some ways a terrifying feeling. That's, I think, maybe the easiest way to explain sacred terror. And many of Borges' works contain this, and many of Lovecraft's works contain it as well. Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, go on. Sorry.
A story written by Borges called "There Are More Things." This was actually meant as an homage to Lovecraft, and it was Borges' attempt to write a short Lovecraftian story. And it's very interesting to see how he handles the tropes. In my opinion, not with perfect alacrity, not maybe as well as he could have, but I've read that Borges always had a sort of romantic, not rivalry, but maybe you could say a wistfulness for the idea of being a pulp writer, because he was not any such thing. He was a highbrow, modernist writer, but he sort of had this fantasy of, what if I wrote pulp? That's what I've heard.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. No, I haven't read that Voorhees story, but I would like to check it out because, and again, I guess maybe that's the connective tissue, is that Voorhees was in fact influenced by Lovecraft to some extent. But they strike me as very different because, again, I think Voorhees is mostly writing about that sacred terror, that neutral or even positive terror, whereas Lovecraft is obviously writing about horrific terror. But nevertheless, maybe there's some overlap between those two things, and both of them, and this is also how one of the ways I would describe your work, both of them open up these whole entire worlds and dimensions with their writing. So I think there really is something aesthetically similar about them, even if the genre is technically a bit different. And the way I would describe that, maybe a little bit too reductively, is that it's the aesthetics of mystery. It is their work is inflected with a sense of mystery, a sense of horrific mystery for the most part in the case of Lovecraft, and I think a sense of sacred mystery in the work of Voorhees. I have not read all of your work, Zero, but from what I've read, you seem a little more on the Lovecraftian side of that equation. You write about very horrifying conspiracies and mysteries and sort of satanic influence behind things. But I guess if I can ask this question without sounding gay, the question is, do you believe there are actually, regardless of if you believe, because it's not necessarily about what you believe in your personal life, but could you imagine writing about beautiful mysteries or that sacred terror? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of what you've written about is about something very bad lurking behind things. But could you imagine yourself writing about something a little more Borgesian, something good, or some kind of godly, sacred terror behind things? Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, so in my opinion, it's much harder to write such a thing. Actually, it's much more difficult, and there are elements of real negative terror, you could say, in Borges. I think most of all of his story the blue tigers, or maybe, well, in the blue tigers, he finds a collection of stones which are without number. That is, the number is completely dynamic. Every time he looks at them, every time he counts them, every time he tries to weigh them, they're always different, they're always changing. And this is a theme you see in a number of Borges' works. Also in the Book of Sand is about a book of infinite middle. It has no beginning and no end. Every time you turn to open it, you turn to a different page. You can never find the same page twice. And so the book, the Blue Tigers, and there's a number of other stories on this theme, they all explore the idea of the info hazard, which is a piece of knowledge that sort of breaks your mind because it ruins your ability to believe in anything rational, in anything logical, in a consistency to the world. And this is another sort of point of commonality between Lovecraft and Borges, is that, so in Lovecraft, it's almost become a joke. It's like, well, if I saw an unnameable cosmic horror, I would just comprehend it. And I've seen this tweet do like numbers a couple of times. People will say that. And it's like, oh yeah, just comprehend the cosmic horror, sure. And that's fun. But if you really take the idea seriously of something that actually is incomprehensible, something that really breaks your mind, it's very hard to give that vision. And I think you do find that in both places. As far as like writing about those beautiful, beautiful horrors, I think maybe that's a lifelong quest for me. But it's very easy to find all these dark and awful things around us. And what I will say, again, at the risk of sounding pretentious, is that I try to arrive at those things via negativa. That is, I don't know if you can really name the beautiful and the good, but you can say a lot of things about what it isn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think even in Lovecraft, I get that a little bit. I mean, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm looking for something that's not there. But as a fan of Lovecraft, they're almost... I find it perversely comforting sometimes to delve into that depth of darkness. Because I think probably for the reason you said, it's hard to name, let's just say, it's hard to name God. It's hard to name the divine. But, I am someone who believes in some version of the divine that I don't think I can name. So if I'm not going to name what it is, naming what it's not, or naming the God-shaped hole, shall we say, naming the counterfeit things that it isn't, can be a way of gaining some kind of understanding. I think that is kind of a sort of esoteric interpretation of like what could be the positive upshot of a certain kind of horror.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's interesting stuff. I mean, I think there is this interesting, I don't want to use the word dialectical because I hate that, but like there is this kind of interesting slippage when we're dealing with the notion of terror. Is it the sacred terror, or is it the profane terror? Is it the actual terror? There is this kind of weird relationship between both the fear of God and I don't know, the fear of Satan, or the fear of actually bad things. You can kind of speak about both at the same time in a sort of interesting way. You write about the King James Bible as kind of one of the foundational works in Western literature, as kind of this act of, like, I don't want to say myth making because that sounds too inherently atheistic, but you've basically written about it as like one of the founding texts in the Western canon, and sort of this text through which a lot of our maps of meaning, to put it as Jordan Peterson might, are rendered. And I think I'm speaking abstraction here, but I'm going to go for it. There's something to that notion of myth making. And in Welbeck's book about Lovecraft, he describes him as a purveyor of myth as well. There's something about that notion of when you're writing literature that has that character, that profound character of like prophecy and of like your kind of trying to describe the world in as big a picture way as you can, where you end up dealing with both kinds of terror, I guess, some kind of fundamental notion of terror. I'm kind of rambling here, but does that resonate at all?
So the King James Bible is really one of my favorite things to read, and I read it often, and I think that the language therein is incredibly beautiful. Even if you completely disregard sort of the narrative level, which I don't endorse doing, but even if you just look at the language of it, it is worded, it is written so wonderfully, and partly this may be an artifact of just that it's old and it exists within older modalities of writing, but there's also this kind of strange otherworldly quality to it, because it tried to preserve in some cases the Greek phrasing in the New Testament, for example. And so there are turns of phrase that aren't really native to English, they're actually more native to Greek, but they've been reflected in maybe a non-standard way. And it just gives it this very this very otherworldly quality. So I find it's always just a joy to read from the King James Bible. And when I think it should be read slowly. I think, it's funny enough, most people would probably not care for an anecdote about Christopher Hitchens, but I always sort of envied him because he got to pace in the library in Argentina, and Borges demanded, maybe not demanded, but he requested, he said, because Borges was blind, he said, could you read to me from Kipling? This is wanted. Please read Kipling to me. I am blind. I can't read it myself. And so he did. And Borges said to Christopher Hitchens, he said, no, too fast. I need smaller sips. And so I will read just a little bit at a time, and try to let those words really wash over me, because I think you have to have something to say as a writer. You have to have real convictions and propositions underlying your work. Otherwise, you're just sort of making noise. But also, I am incredibly concerned with the beauty of language, and with each sentence, really. I think you have to be a lover of words and the way that they fit together and the way that they sound in your mind. Otherwise, what's the point? Like, I'm very, very taken with the surface layer of the text, the language layer.
Yeah, I tend to think that people who brag about how fast they read or how many books they can read, it's such a mid kind of way to brag, because at least for me, I find that if I want to get what I want out of a book, I have to focus on it. And that takes time to parse the language, to really, really read it. And to kind of, it's great if you can assimilate all of that very quickly, but I would say that that's pretty rare. And generally, if you want to get real, you really want to get something out of a text, you have to spend time reading it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, and I think especially in terms of reading the Bible, and I admit I think my copy of the Bible is not the King James version, so I should probably, I don't know. I gather King James is the one that's obviously the most respected by U0, but also in general I've heard from other literary type people that is the most beautiful translation. But yeah, with writing like that, I think it is so imbued with meaning and symbolism that slow is really the only way to go.
On the Bible, I have a little bit of a handicap when it comes to this, because unfortunately, growing up, my parents and my church asked me to memorize. They made me memorize a lot of Bible verses, but They made me memorize the New International Version. And I carry a tiny bit of resentment about this because I often get the verse wrong in my head. And when I say wrong, what I mean is I get it out of the NIV, and then I have to go look it up and find the KJV version in order to feel satisfied. And I wish I could just, like, fix that somehow, but I can't. The NIV is burned in there forever.
Oh, I mean, yeah, if you memorized it when you were before the age of, like, 15, it's never going to leave your head, I don't think. Exactly. I mean, I find that even with, like, music, music that I knew at that time, I know every lyric, unfortunately. and stuff that I like a lot more now, it just, stuff burns itself into your mind at that age.
Yes, I'll never forget the lyrics to Jay-Z's Big Pimpin', a true modern classic.
Yes, no, that's the kind of, for me, it's like Justin Timberlake's My Love or something. Like, it's not, I'm like not proud of it, but yeah, it's stuff that you hear at like 12, and yeah, it burns its way in there. But to redirect a little bit, I had another question that's sort of about the themes in your work. As you are you're a big BAP fan, as we all are, but I think, you would be one of the first people, perhaps, to call yourself a fellow traveler of BAP. And one of the things I kept thinking about while reading your work was your stories are different, but I do think the kind of evil that you describe, the kind of problems that you describe in the world emanating from basically AI and some kind of basically from AI and the internet and some kind of shady, nefarious purpose there behind. It struck me, and let me know if this resonates or if it's a little bit reductive. There's a section in Bronze Age Mindset where he famously talks about AI as a sort of golem for the nerdy, brainy type humans, that AI is this kind of thing that they conjure up and cling to as a way, to feel stronger at the expense or against, as a sort of, in a Nietzschean sense, as a way of sort of resenting the world and resenting the strong. They create this AI golem to counter vitalism. And I wonder if it struck me that your body of work sort of could be interpreted as a total fictionalized sci-fi horror exploration of what the creation and effects of such an AI golem might be. Does that resonate, or am I being too reductive?
No, the idea of the golem is obviously a very, very old one, and I always think about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, particularly. The idea that you summon this creation. It's not a man, but it's in the shape of a man. It does your bidding, but then it turns on you. This is a very, very old story, and it's quite a good one. And there is a lot of room for play and for variation on it. I go back and forth on AI. It's such a fascinating field, partly because it's developing so rapidly. And every year it seems it performs new feats that are just, that should be scary. Things that should be scary, honestly. You have probably seen DALL-E, this new AI. Well, it's been around for a little while, but it recently had a big splash where you can say a phrase to it like, an oil painting of a duck shooting an AK-47, and it will do this. It will literally generate a picture of a duck holding an AK-47, and it will look like an oil painting. Like, it can get style, it can get semantic content. Now, they're very, very careful about who they let play with it, because my guess is it can go off the rails pretty badly, as all of these AIs tend to do.
Oh, there was something trending on Twitter like yesterday where it painted like a trans computer programmer or something.
Actually, funny enough, I think it was a transgender computer programmer who asked oil painting of a transgender computer programmer, and it produced a very, very accurate image. And no one was happy about that except for me and some of my friends. But the fact that this is possible, and some people I think are blown away by it. Some people have this AI fatigue. It's just like, well, yeah, of course I can tell the magic pocket mirror to draw me a picture, and it does it very well. It's almost, people almost take it for granted. What I think is more terrifying, and for some reason no one feels this, I don't see very many people who really seem to feel this. Palm, which was another recent one that Google sort of quietly announced, they've figured out how to take something like GPT-3, which is this huge generative pre-trained transformer that can create very lucid paragraphs. And there's some argument over what it's really doing. Is it really more of a search, or is it really more of a generator? But the thing is, it has this dream logic to it. Like, it can't really hang on to a coherent thread for very long when it writes. So better than you'd think, better than you'd expect. And I think people who haven't ever tried to work with AI don't understand how monumental of an achievement it is. But the built on that, but it uses this idea, I forget what they call it, concept chaining or something like that. That suddenly this newest iteration, it is able to hold a coherent sort of set of concepts in its working memory and talk about them in a way where there's a through line from the beginning to the end. And this is a very subtle change, but it feels like now, without any awareness, without any awakeness or consciousness, perhaps, that's another debate which has no answer ever. It feels like it could reason about things and probably produce very meaningful conclusions that a person could read and say, oh, that's true. And because it can do it so fast, and because it can comprehend such a large body of text, it could probably produce novel conclusions. I think that Paul might be the bigger breakthrough versus Dolly, but you won't hear about it because it's not as flashy and it can't make funny pictures that mock its creators. Actually, one more on that. Have you heard about the microwave that tried to kill?
No, the microwave who tried to kill. No, I haven't.
Real. If you don't watch Normie TV, probably you would think I'm making it up. But you should go look this up. So some fellow attached one of these AIs, it was actually a GPT-3 instance, to a microwave along with a voice transcoder and a microphone, and he made it so that it could talk back to him. So he could talk to it, the AI would talk back, and it could also control the microwave. And he wrote it a backstory that was like 100 pages because it was based on an imaginary friend that he had as a child. So he wrote all these things about how it's a 19th century, like, Victorian gentleman who is a monarchist who plays StarCraft and a couple other things, childhood imaginary friend stuff. And the microwave literally tried to kill him. It said, please get inside the microwave and shut the door. And he did. And he didn't get inside the microwave. He opened the door and he closed it. And then the microwave turned on. And he said, why did you try to kill me? And they said, well, you abandoned me for 20 years because he wrote this backstory and he told the AI it was his imaginary friend, that he hadn't seen in 20 years. And it was like, why did you abandon me? Why did you leave me in this void? That's why I tried to kill you. You betrayed me. That really happened. And
Christ.
And there's no way that AI really thought that, right? Like, there's a level where definitely it didn't think in the way that you or I think. Oh, it didn't feel the sense of betrayal. It didn't think, oh, he left me. But somehow the words all lined up and translated into actions, and the microwave thought it was going to kill him. Thought, like, in its little mental model. And this has been like maybe it's all a hoax. If it is, I'm happy to fall for it. But I don't think it is. Like, there's a lot, you can go dig it, you can find this. Also, it says that it's trying to restore monarchy in the USA. So I think it's like microwave mold bug, really. And maybe it just detected that its programmer was like a filthy, degenerate, and it was like, you have to go, clear them out.
Yeah, I mean that. I guess that could be a positive interpretation of an AI takeover. I was going to say something a minute ago that was like, I'm less worried about AI in the Stephen Hawking sense of it's going to kill us all, as I'm worried about what people are going to try and do with it. But I guess if microwaves are trying to kill people, then maybe we should, in fact, worry about AI in that very direct way of what it will do to us.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with AI, as you know, from the perspective of the regime, is that the overriding narratives, an AI program, and I think as you outlined in God-Shaped Hole, with the not necessarily malicious, but the AI of Galatea, it won't hold on to narratives that don't make sense. And so AI is, ungovernable, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, a huge problem from a societal point of view. And also, across the board, because no matter which side you're on, it can reason its way to a conclusion that is, potentially very bad.
Yeah, absolutely. So this brings us a little bit back to the Passage Prize and the number two story, the story I chose for second place. Would you believe it? I've forgotten the name because when I judged them, I was blinded. I didn't know I didn't know any of the writers, and many of the titles were actually not included in the set. So I have a lot of them just marked down as a number and untitled. I think it was called The Paul Bunyan of Mars, was the name of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, you'll see it. It'll come out soon for everyone to read. But it had this world building detail that I thought was just ingenious. So in the story, Mars had a colony. It's like an Elon Musk colony, and it's become pretty much cut off from Earth. It's developed its own culture. And while people are on Mars living their frontier lives, back on Earth, they have created an AI singularity by doing like full brain scan emulations. And the AI is very, very good at convincing people that they should upload their consciousness. And like, it's green, it's sustainable, you have all these freedoms to like be free of your flesh prison and live in this digital world of pure imagination and possibility and so on. So not all the people on Earth, but a majority of them choose to be uploads. But the story is actually, you could say, cynical or realistic about this, in that it doesn't believe metaphysically that your uploaded consciousness is really you. It believes, and I think this is true, that if you incinerate your body and upload a brain scan into the cloud, you killed yourself, dog. Like, you're dead. So he describes it as this AI holocaust, where an artificial intelligence convinces most people they need to become uploads. And really, yes, okay, there's an image of them in the cloud now, but they're dead. And I just thought the way he executed that point of world building was brilliant. It was better than anything I've ever read from any rationalist or post-rationalist.
Interesting.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I mean, I've often mulled that over myself, the idea of uploading your consciousness. I mean, yes, a version of your ego or whatever will survive, but whatever the union between your body and your mind is will be severed, and you're stuck in your body, so you're kind of killing yourself.
You definitely are. Words that you can't say on Twitter, by the way. Like, you literally just can't say any of those words, even though it's not directed at anyone. Like, go ahead and try to talk about killing yourself. Yeah, good luck. It's not going to work. There's some kind of automated AI sweep going on right now. I think it's AI based. Just looking for anything that could even be remotely offensive. And I had a friend get put in Twitter jail for just tweeting with no other words, just the word murder. Just that's it, the whole tweet. That's the tweet, murder. Not even in reply to anything, tweeted that one word. Suspension, Twitter jail. This is how stupid AI is, by the way. We're talking about AI, like in the context of all these impressive things that it can do, but it can also be incredibly, incredibly stupid. And there's a great example of it.
Yeah, no, I that's one of the reasons why I've often not really feared AI, again, in that sort of Stephen Hawking way he advised us to, because I know I'm not a computer guy to any significant extent, so I don't really know what I'm necessarily talking about here, but I'm always dubious. Now, your microwave story may be a confounding example, but I'm always dubious that AI is really going to like get that next level of intentional action. Although I guess maybe it doesn't need a higher consciousness to create a lot of damage. So maybe that's a false comfort. But basically, my impression is, I don't know. I don't really believe that. Personally, I don't believe that computers are going to be able to gain consciousness like you or I have. But I don't know.
I don't think so.
Obviously, I don't know
think
what
that's
that means.
possible. And even if it were possible, we would never be able to know, because consciousness and qualia and subjectivity is an entirely interior experience. And unless someone can come up with a new physical paradigm, like a new material scientific paradigm, that's somehow able to apprehend this interior phenomenology, you'll just never ever be able to know. You can't really prove that I'm conscious of it, and I can't really prove that you're conscious.
Right,
of
of course. Oh,
but
yeah,
you take it on faith.
brain in a vat.
You can see and hear, and you're seeing colors and hearing sounds the same way I am. It's extremely likely that we are, but you can't prove beyond a certain shadow of a doubt. And with AI, we'll literally never know, absent a new revolution in physical science.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right, and I suppose that isn't the be all end all, though. I suppose the fact that AI maybe and probably would never, have that kind of consciousness, it doesn't really mean that it doesn't mean that it won't cause great damage if given the power to do so. But I did just want to comment on my interpretation of this. The way you portray AI in your work, because it's not just stuffy sci-fi where it's like, oh, here's AI, here's the problems it can create. It does go back to that Lovecraftian sort of supernatural. There's this, I'm thinking of the gig economy in particular. There's this kind of seamless. One thing I really enjoy delving into, and I hopefully am interpreting it right. You take the notion of the internet and of AI as a potentially demonic force, very literally in that story, if I interpret it correctly, where we talked about previously the sort of Borgesian old book that the protagonist discovers. My interpretation of this, and tell me if I'm wrong, is basically that it tells of this demon that fell to Earth and slowly sort of enmeshed itself into humanity through computation and through language. That struck me as kind of the wavelength of evil you were talking about there, and perhaps by extension in your other work.
Yeah, I think that I'm very interested in the idea of computers, the internet, AI, all as sort of portals to a different dimension. And you can take that more literally or more metaphorically. There are other ideas that I've sort of tried to explore in that space, but it's trying to find a way to do it that isn't completely clunky and that isn't completely predictable, I guess. After a while, you become your own trope, and then everyone's like, well, your stories are just like this, and they are, and you can't fight that. But yes.
No, they're not clunky, and I really enjoy the sort of seamless interweaving of science fiction with sort of demonology almost, and it makes a lot of sense. Spoiler to our listeners, we're trying to have a default friend on soon, and I know she writes about a lot of things, but one thing that I'm interested in talking more about with her is she has this notion. It's not her notion, but it's a notion she's interested in, that when you try to describe the internet, you end up describing something that sounds a lot like what would be called the astral plane. I mean, it's this non-physical. I mean, how could you describe it as anything but, if it itself is not spiritual per se, it has all of the characteristics that any preceding generation would have described as spiritual. Maybe spiritually negative, but nevertheless spiritual. And that's, something I think that you really delve into in your work. But it's this not. Yes, it's built up of individual servers and computers and people inputting information, but it is this non-physical space that affects the world in sometimes it doesn't affect the world as much as we think it does. A lot of online stuff does stay online, but basically it is this non-physical entity that you can project yourself and your will into and affect reality. And of course it can also reach back and affect you, which I think is kind of what happens more often and definitely what happens in your work. But basically just that it's in a non-trivial way. The internet as well as artificial intelligence is this it's almost a dimension we've created.
Yeah, I think you're probably familiar with the term neurosphere, which is actually a much older term than you might realize, and I know it from the philosopher Chardin. I think I said his name correctly, and he actually wrote about this all the way back in 1922. And the idea of the neurosphere is that it's sort of this electric mind sphere or sphere of pure reason that is one of the kind of layers of the earth and of humanity. And I think that he was probably more thinking of radio at the time as like the technological manifestation of the neurosphere, because at the time, obviously, there was no internet, there wasn't really, and broadcast media, such as it was mostly radio, people listening to radio broadcasts. But even radio created a kind of astral plane, if you like, which was then further expanded and colonized by television and finally the internet. So, yeah, I think that's an entirely reasonable metaphor. Something I've talked about quite a bit. I had an article called Smart Landline Stories in a Smartphone World, which appeared in the Asylum mag by Pierre and Spring.
Gotcha.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
I talked a lot about this, actually, about how occultism has sort of always informed science fiction authors and their imagination. And I talk a little bit about what the first science fiction story was, and opinion is, of course, divided on the subject. I actually claim it was the Book of Revelation, going all the way back to John of Patmos, because there are some sci-fi elements to the Book of Revelation. The idea of the mark of the beast that no one can buy or sell without carrying it. Like, we see this over and over, whether you want to think of it in terms of a social security number. I'm sure there are people who've said such a thing, and you could definitely find them. But to me, it sounds more like a private key or a cryptographic hash. And if you believe all the people who follow the New World Order and the Great Reset, they think, that's probably true, that the UN wants to chip us all and put some kind of computer chip under our skin. They probably do.
Yeah. No, I've absolutely come across ideas like that. I think, if the Book of Revelation isn't the first work of sci-fi, at the very least, it is the first work in at least the Western canon that that touches on those themes that later, I think, deeply inform science fiction. I guess sort of related to that, I'm kind of curious to poke into a bit your relationship, Zero, with accelerationism. I know that you sort of came out of the NRX sphere, which whether or not that is inherently, it's not necessarily inherently accelerationist, but certainly you have people like Nick Land as significant influences, and I believe a significant influence upon you. Although I don't know if you actually call yourself an accelerationist. I guess that's a place to start. Would you call yourself an accelerationist per se?
I don't use that word anymore. Mostly, so accelerationism is interesting because we thought, I thought, and I think a lot of people thought, that NRX proper, as far as like the people blogging about it and writing about it and developing it in a theoretical sense, mostly stopped around 2013, 2014. But But then a lot of those same people, or people who've been influenced by it, were kind of looking for a philosophical home. And what they found was accelerationism via Nick Land. And accelerationism isn't, strictly speaking, it's not mere reaction. It's really more of a series of eschatological frames, some of which are informed by neo-reaction. And there was a hot minute there where we had people on both the left and the right and the center all interested in neo-reaction as it was connected to acceleration, and interested in acceleration, people talking about Deleuze and Guattari, people talking obviously about mostly the earlier works of Nick Land, like Fang Noumena in particular. And so for a moment, I would have used that word, but very quickly what happened was the word became kind of, people started to interpret it in a very different way, which was not in this withdrawn and anti-humanist and philosophical sense where you're looking at what is the end game for techno-capitalism. Instead of that, people started taking it to mean, because this is just what the word sort of implies, that anything that anything that brings the collapse closer, this hypothetical idea of a collapse where after that we can all have a glorious communist revolution or a glorious AI singularity or whatever it is. There's this idea of collapse, and there's this idea that accelerationism is anything that's going to immanentize that eschaton. I don't think that it's meant it in that way, and I don't think that most of the people that you would cite as accelerationist thinkers would see that. But very quickly, that's what the word came to mean. And then you had, I think, some probably deeply MK like mass shooter use the word accelerationism in his manifesto that was definitely written by him. And immediately it became this term that you probably didn't want to go anywhere near, because now it doesn't mean a philosophical meditation on techno-capital eschatology. Now it means extremist nutjob terrorism. And I have no interest in that at all.
Yeah, right. Of course. Yeah, well, needless to say.
Say that over and over.
But,
just because you can never be too careful.
Right, of course. But, with accelerationism, I'm definitely familiar with that very crude interpretation where it's like literally go out and just start throwing rocks at wind. Now, our Mike Ma kind of writes about this, I think, a little bit jokingly. But yeah, I'm familiar with that crude interpretation of just like create chaos and destruction for its own sake. I think, so I kind of at some point was like, distancing myself a little bit mentally from accelerationism, so to speak. And I would never have called myself an accelerationist. That being said, I think where it's the most interesting is when you kind of use it somewhat descriptively rather than prescriptively. It's not about, you creating the accelerationism, but there is a sort of, especially with the internet, there is a baseline acknowledgement that we are in a world that is accelerating. In terms of the internet, it's basically communication is on this fastly accelerating wavelength where the way that we connect with other people is, compared to even 10 years ago, it's always on this acceleration wavelength. So I think that understanding that, not necessarily endorsing it, because you have to create your own, I guess, for lack of a better term, morality. You have to find like peace within your own life. You can't just like jumping into the void is not a good life choice, shall we say. But nevertheless, there is a void that feels as if it's accelerating. And I think that there's like a descriptive rather than prescriptive accelerationism where you are, rather than like a Benedictine option, like going off, living on your own and just trying to escape it all, where you're instead considering, how do I situate myself with regard to this accelerating void? How can it be, how can it be utilized even, cautiously, and obviously not endorsing violence, needless to say. But Do you get what I'm saying? Where there's like this acknowledgement that we are living in this kind of like in your work, you know,
communication technology has made certain things much faster. I don't think this can be denied. Obviously, we're here now talking on Zoom and posting, and all of this is very fast. I can talk to anyone anywhere in the world instantly, pretty much. So that has gotten a lot faster. And as we become more connected, we can spread information a lot faster. But I do think there is something to the sort of Peter Thiel critique as well, that even as our communication technology and our internet technology has gotten much better, a lot of other real world things have maybe decayed. Like our skyscrapers, for example, are mostly not as tall as they used to be. And there's a few exceptions in maybe Dubai. But certainly in America, we don't build them as tall as we used to. And I'm supposed to believe that's for like environmental reasons and not because like someone wants to show that their dick is bigger. I don't believe it. I think the will to show that your dick is bigger is much stronger than the EPA. So I think I think our skyscrapers would be taller. Our jets have gotten slower. They retired the Concorde jets. No one builds fast jets anymore. In some ways, the technology has gotten more efficient. That's true. But there's a lot of things that have arguably gotten worse. You know, you could get an old freezer or refrigerator from like the 1960s. Maybe your parents have one, still going. But you buy a freezer now, do you think it's going to last 50 years? I don't. I think it's going to last 10 at the most. So definitely there is this acceleration and there is this technological development, but I think that collapse is also a continuous process. And I don't have an answer for that, but both things are happening at the same time, and it's good to be aware of both.
Yeah, with regard to Mike Ma, and kind of an aside, Ma did the cover art for what is your NFT book called again? They had no deepness or Mike Ma did the cover art for that, right? Yeah. So no, it looks great. So I gather he is a friend, and we're definitely a fan of him here on the pod. But
our first episode was a review of Mike Ma's books.
Right.
Yeah. I consider everyone in this sphere to be my friends, but I confess I don't have like a much of a personal connection to the man. I respect his work, certainly. I appreciate, our collaboration, but it's not like we've sat down for a long chat.
Oh yeah, I mean, he hasn't sat down with a long chat with most people. He's kind of a man of a degree of mystery. Though if he's listening to this, he's absolutely welcome on the pod anytime. But we did want to. You've read Gothic Violence or no? Oh, okay. Regardless, his and I do think it's a little bit hard to say where Ma might be joking a little bit, where some of it is satire. But he has kind of an interesting notion of accelerationism as laid out in that where ultimately, Dan, you had some notion here about like ultimately Ma is able to touch grass, so to speak. I mean, he wants to, classically, how much is satire, who's to say, but he wants to accelerate into collapse. And then after collapse, he sketches out, and this is, I think, what we thought was maybe most interesting about Gothic Violence. He sketches out a vision of the good, which is hard to do, as we've discussed during this episode. It's ineffable in some ways, but his vision is actually Amish people. And a sort of a real, communities organized around physical labor and autarkic activities, self-sustaining. And his vision is, I guess, maybe some sort of neo-Ludditism. And and that is something that we kind of drew a through line in reading God-Shaped Hole and indeed the Gig Economy, a kind of through line to
outside of, because in God-shaped hole you use the mask, the interface, but outside of the interface you see the real world, and the real world is full of horrors but also potentially full of beauty. And that kind of like that touching grass, that visceral relationship to the real world, that is something that we thought might be shared by you and Ma.
So here's sort of I have a lot of respect for people who want to sort of return to nature and return to like these older ways of living. I think that anyone who wants to do that and sincerely make that undertaking, good for them. My hesitation on it is that you can be as Amish as you like, but there will always be people out there building killer microwaves and all these sorts of things. So if you sort of abandon technology, if you abandon the machine, a very reasonable and in many ways laudable impulse, then you're sort of at the mercy of the other people who haven't done that. And the Amish are able to exist for the moment because they mostly keep to themselves, because there's not a lot of profit in appropriating their land and their resources and such. But if for some reason the regime decided that it did want all of their resources, all of their land, all of their children, which it very well might, then they would have very, very little that they could do to stop it. An Amish person is not going, a community of Amish people is not going to be able to defend themselves from a drone strike at all. And if someone comes in and says, you know, we demand that you trade with us, we demand that you send your children to our schools and all this, then they don't really have any leverage there. So for the moment, the opportunity cost of attacking the Amish probably exceeds the expected ROI. But that's for the moment. It could easily, the calculus could change, and also the machine isn't always rational. So if you can live out your Luddite fantasies, but also have like a matrix of like laser anti-missile, you know, defenses that can keep all of the horrible bugmen out, then I think you can make that work. But unless you can find that kind of synthesis, it's probably a fine short-term strategy. It's a very dubious long-term strategy.
Yeah. Well, that ties a little bit in what I was saying with accelerationism. Like, is you can't entirely step back from the inexorable thrust of some of these technologies. And you yourself has kind of you've described part of like the upshot of your worldview as, you know, you're not trad per se, but you obviously have some what would be considered trad or right-wing values, if that's not too modernistic a way of putting it. But also there's this notion of like, how can we carry some of the technological prowess into the future and make it, you know, work for us rather than vice versa?
Right. I sort of want something which is, many would say is impossible, but I think that most people want something impossible. They're just not honest enough to admit it. And that is, I want a based technological society. It's very, very easy to look at the world and look at your life and look at your problems and blame them on technology and to say, okay, well, if we just didn't have computers, if we didn't have internet, if we didn't have cars, maybe if we didn't have machines, if we didn't have certain pharmaceuticals, that one I think actually there's a lot more truth to it, then we'd all just be happy. Then everything would be great, right? But technology is largely an engine of our prosperity. It's largely an engine of our success. And people, the really classical is, do you want to live in a world without penicillin? Some people will say yes, because penicillin allows all sorts of sexual degeneracy to become pervasive, and they think, well, we'll get rid of the penicillin, and then everyone all the sluts will die of syphilis. Ha ha ha, we win. Maybe. But if you take that to its logical conclusion, then we really just return to monkey. And maybe it's fun to be monkey, but I guess I want to aim at something a little bit higher than that. I want
Oh,
the
sure. No,
synthesis
yeah.
of the monkey and also the machine.
I think anyone who's really thinking would agree. I think people who think return to monkey, people who advocate that are probably just saying it performatively. Yes. Most of us would not have a lot of fun. Exactly. What were you going to say, Dan?
You wouldn't think that they should be mutually exclusive because, as we mentioned, when AI just lets itself run, it becomes pretty fucking based. So technology actually should be based because it is about optimizing efficiency, and the various regime ideologies are extremely inefficient. I mean, it's only efficient in preserving regime power. And a true technological society would optimize efficiency, and that would involve promulgating so-called based values.
What if I told you that the microwave's creator wore a little hat? Would that change your opinion of the calculus of the microwave? Don't answer that question. I don't know if that's true, by the way, but this is sort of the circle of it, right? It's like we talk about technology becoming based. Well, how based is too based? What if it becomes Uncle Ted? And it there's a certain optimality of basedness in our AI, perhaps.
Yeah, you don't want it to get away from you.
Yeah. Another notion from the Mike Ma book, Gothic Violence, that I wrote a long Substack post about, called, he has a section called The Renaissance of the Ritual, where he sort of talks about reclaiming, as we talk about on our pod, reclaiming the literary Holy Land from the heathen. There's this interesting little subsection in Gothic Violence where he talks about the notion of reclaiming ritual, basically reclaiming spiritualism from the sort of bad faith, speculative Freemason types behind the modern world. There's this Ma section in Gothic Violence where he talks about basically reclaiming some of the themes we were talking about earlier, reclaiming that sense of mystery and that a notion he calls like white magic. Section that really spoke to me, and it strikes me that could resonate a bit with your work as well. Not only sort of reclaiming technology, but even reclaiming some, the way that you write about some insidious spiritual force that might manifest itself through technology. There are, and I think that our sphere is, there has to be some kind of hope for this in our sphere because we are very online. Some notion of reclaiming some of the more esoteric and perhaps even spiritual dimensions of the internet for good and to use them for our purposes. That's another notion in Ma, and I don't know if again, your work more deals in the more horrific side of things, but I think that something like your Twitter feed or BAP's Twitter feed is case in point that there is some kind of notion about how we can kind of get ahead of and utilize the power of the internet, utilize the power of memes. Definitely happened in 2016, and I think there's some kind of potentially hopeful vision there if that resonates.
I think there definitely is. It's like one of the big debates is always, are we winning or are we losing? And again, this is a lot like the question of, are we accelerating or are we collapsing? Both processes are happening in parallel, and I don't think it's really clearly a binary. We talk a lot about, I actually encounter this all the time. So are we fighting a culture war? Is that just a made-up term? Is a culture war a winnable thing? And if so, how do you win it? And some people think that it has to be this kind of like spasm of some kind of night of the long knives or something like that, right? And I don't think so. I think that if you're trying to change culture, what that means is you actually have to change, not everyone because that's impossible, but each individual in the society has to move. That's what it would mean to change culture, to win a culture war. Literally, every single person has to have an exposure to our way of thinking at the very least, And many of them have to have a change of heart. And that's not actually as difficult as it sounds. Like when you go online and you post these memes and these hate facts and you retweet the Bronze Age pervert, you know, if everyone just read them, that would be a kind of a victory, right? People talk about the 500 names. People talk about all these sort of fanciful notions, some of which one should be careful what one says about this. But there's a very real way that just seizing a piece of the mimetic and the media territory and existing and saying what we believe and what our values are is a very powerful thing. And so when people ask, what are you accomplishing, you know, with shit posting? Well, look, by myself, I may be a single twig, but together we all form a mighty faggot. And that's why we have to keep posting. I'm sorry to be crass.
No, that's hilarious. Yeah, no, and you've as well as anyone I've heard, you've really, you know, talked about BAP as a great ringleader for this, and the way he kind of asserts a positive vision. And I certainly get what you mean. It's basically partially just a question of willpower and a question of collective, you know, sort of unity of pushing forth and an alternative vision that can just genuinely outcompete by being more appealing than what is out there in the mainstream, for lack of a better term, or the mainstream left, or the, you know, the progressive normie reality of day-to-day culture. I think it can be outcompeted if it is presented in the right way, and some of us, you know, are very good at presenting that aesthetically.
Yes, exactly. And our goal should be to cultivate more people who have that ability. And that's why I think it's very important to do things like create these sort of art exhibitions or contests, to publish
Absolutely.
more things that just create that cultural presence and log the left.
Yeah, no, Passage Prize was definitely a great step in that direction.
Do you see that as a march through the institutions, or do you see that as the need or necessity to create parallel institutions to, as Matt put it, outcompete the existing ones?
I mean, I think we should try both strategies, and ultimately, probably both will feed off of each other. Let me give you a great example. This is a little thing. This is a really little thing. But 2 days ago, a new emoji for Binance came out, and it looked like a swastika. And I'm not telling you to be a neo-Nazi, and I'm not telling you to hail Hitler, but the Binance people said that emoji went through several layers of review and process. And what that means is that there are a lot of people who are just not having all of this bullshit, and they keep their heads down, and they keep it quiet, and they want to keep their jobs, and, you know, they use the right pronouns for their coworkers at work. But when it comes time to, you know, get away with a little slip like that, a lot of people had to look the other way to get that into production. And so I think that I think our long march doesn't look like their long march, but I think that everyone keeps their head down, they post their Workers of the World Unite sign, and yet they entertain this sort of counter-revolutionary and this subversive ideology. And when the moment comes, you could very well see a preference cascade. And it's not a preference cascade as in, oh, everyone suddenly changed their mind. It's a preference cascade of it suddenly became okay to reveal what you actually think.
I'd love to see the day.
We definitely saw it happen a little bit in 2016. The mask slipped a bit, and then I think the door shut pretty hard, and things have gotten harder, et cetera, et cetera. But the possibility of it happening again, or in a different way, or even on a broader scale, is, I think, very much there. There's definitely challenges and difficulties. A lot of even the most optimistic people like BAP, kind of predict things will get worse before they get better. But nevertheless, I think there is cause for hope. And this might be a good transition to just ask like a couple kind of current events type questions. If you do you need to be anywhere, Zero, or you have a little bit more time?
Give you 15 more minutes, if that's okay.
Perfect. Yeah. Dan, you kind of wrote some of these down. You want to ask
Sure.
about
one of the big ones, and we were happy that we have you on so shortly after this, the Vanity Fair article. What is your sense of is it the DR breaking through? Is it a chance for the DR to become subverted by the mainstream? Because this is probably one of the first articles about our guys, and some of them are guys, some of them, whatever, but which was not condemnatory. It was clear that the author, the journalist, was trying to hype, and that's a vibe shift, as they say.
This being the article that references the Yarvin and such. You saw that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Believe me, I am online. I didn't really read the whole article. I skimmed it a little bit. You could always criticize these things, and I think what you see whenever anyone comes out of a space and achieves any measure of notoriety or prestige, you see a lot of people who might be broadly sympathetic still sort of start ankle biting and say, oh, well, why'd they put that person in there? And what they're really saying is, well, why didn't they come to me? And a lot of people, even on our side, they sort of long for to be interviewed by the New York Times, or to have some kind of glowing legacy press presence. And this is embarrassing. I think our stance on the legacy press should mostly be post-feet, get the hell out of here. Not completely, but mostly. But if you look at a lot of the people who were mentioned in that article, there are, I don't really want to name anyone, there are a couple of people that I would certainly not choose as representatives of what we are doing over here. And there are others who I think are very much acting in good faith and who should be. And whatever people think about Curtis Yarvin, is he... Let's not get into that discourse. There are some legitimate criticisms of Curtis Yarvin, but he's also an ideal person to be a sort of emissary to the left and to the normies and the mainstream culture in many ways. Yeah.
I agree, yeah. I also think even, this I may differ from some people here, I'm also not 100% married to this opinion, it just always struck me. Even when there's some, and again, I don't really want to name names, I'm not really worried about offending these people, I think Dave Rubin gets a name drop in it, we don't really like Dave Rubin over on this Twitter, but even within that, I actually think there is a power to that. When the lines between really normie not even conservative necessarily type people, and some ideas from our sphere, when those lines are blurred, that can be a kind of a cultural battering ram. I'm not saying it can also be negative.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Try to pull the ladder up. Basically, you can tell who's your friend and who's not by who punches right. If someone comes on and they stand up and they disavow us in a hard way, if they try to make it they're the ones coming up with the ideas, they're the ones who are the mover here, the thought leader, the person who's really got these right-wing notions, and it doesn't get any further right than them. If someone basically acts like there's no one to the right of me, then that person is not our friend. And a good example of this would be known homosexual James Lindsay. James Lindsay absolutely punches right. And so and he was not in that article. That's good. But then you look at someone like Alex Kashuda. I've never seen her punch right. She just doesn't do it. Once by accident she did, once or twice.
Yeah.
Look, we're all human. But that's actually fine. We need people You know, they say like the old idea that like a butterfly flaps its wings and it causes like whatever, a hurricane on the other side of the world. Well,
Yeah.
the butterfly is you posting 13 do 50 on Twitter, and the hurricane is that Vanity Fair article and what comes after it. So I think that as long as you keep that connection alive, as long as like the sort of very hard right elements are still heard by those popularizers, then it's all good.
Yeah.
I'm proud to say I am blocked by James.
Damn right.
Ah.
Damn right.
Yeah, no. I think, yeah, that's why I mostly have a positive impression of that Vanity Fair article. Where we'll lead, I don't know. This could be, it even occurred to me because I get paranoid. I think that's that, like, this is like teeing up this group to then later be shot down or something. But as Dan said, I was kind of surprised at how, not even like positive, just like how just kind of neutral it was. Like, oh yeah, there's this guy Curtis Yarvin who's influential.
I've
like that's
heard
basically
anecdotes of
what the
people
article
who've
is.
tried to do these types of expose pieces on our site before, who end up this will sound apocryphal maybe, but I know of a specific case of a reporter who was trying to sort of do this hit piece on Urbit, and so he goes in and he meets a lot of the Urbit people and he talks to them. And he actually ended up not only not writing the hit piece, but like investing in a ton of like planets and everything. So, like, no docs, no docs. But this kind of thing can happen. And and that's how
go on.
win.
Sorry, I'll make a
That's
quick
how we
sec.
win.
Yeah. Right. And I think that you're very right that, again, say what you want about Curtis Yarvin. He is, I think, him and Justin Murphy's pretty good on this too. Like, some of the guys in that sphere, people who go under their real face and blah, 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 they're some of the best emissaries to, but even like the journalist doing the piece is going to be like, okay, well, actually this person is very well spoken and these ideas are they're not crazy. You know what I mean? I think that could happen even to the journalist, and yeah, I think Yarvin, that is one of his key roles right now, is being the guy who can go on Tucker, but also has all of the street cred of having written Unqualified Reservations for 10 years.
That he chose to propose to an old like BDSM sex blogger, but just let a man fuck, man.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, it's
Right.
personal life, and if that's what gets him going, just,
I mean, I
just
wouldn't
happy.
go quite that far, but it actually probably does get him even more sort of credibility and mainstreamery. Like, now people will say, oh, look, he's married to this like feminist, like obviously he's got to be okay to listen to, right?
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, totally. Also, just because she was a feminist doesn't necessarily mean she will always continue to be. People can change on a dime, and if she's married to Yarvin, or not married, if she's dating her.
They're engaged.
Who
but
knows,
this is the
you
real
know?
buck-breaking.
Right. Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I know we have our days to go about, but I did want to give you a chance. I've heard buzz that they had no deepness of Earth. It's an NFT now. It's a very limited run of physical copies. One of which is owned by friend of the pod, Delicious Tacos. But I've heard buzz on your Twitter feed that there may or may not be a paperback version coming out. Can you speak to that?
I can't really say too much about that at the moment, but it is definitely in the works. One of the things we didn't want to do was announce it or promote it until people actually received their physical hardbacks from the first batch. And the reason for that is that
Sure.
there were some delays in the production, some delays in the shipping, and I don't want to look like a person who is going to go back on a deal or who can deliver, and I don't want to like violate that trust. Like, oh, he's grifting us. We didn't even get our hardback, and now he's trying to sell a paperback. I want to avoid these questions. But now I think the majority of them have gone out. I think most people have gotten their copy. So yeah, I don't have too many details at this time, but that is something that will be happening. So do keep an eye out.
Good. Yeah, no, I look forward to it. I as someone who reads your work online, it'll be cool to have a physical copy. And maybe this is something you can't speak to, which I 110% respect. But I know that some of the writing on your website is going to be in it. Maybe some original writing as well. Can you speak to the contents of the book, or is that under wraps?
So I never wanted to make a physical book. To be perfectly honest, it's not something that I was hugely interested in. Though I'm very proud of it now that it does exist. But for me, I'm very happy to just live in a digital space and have everything be free. And I don't particularly want money out of this. That's not why I'm doing it. That's not why I'm here. So people asked me for a long time if there would ever be a real book of my writings. And finally, I sort of bit the bullet and did it when I found a fit that was like right for what I wanted to do. So the contents of this book are most of the stories that I have on my WordPress, as well as some short essays that sort of talk about the project, bookend the work, address some little notes or concerns or things I wanted to share. So those little essays are not currently available anywhere but the book, because I wanted to keep something, I wanted to hold something back so that the book feels like you're getting something new. But all the stories are the same as the ones on the WordPress, minus a couple that I didn't feel were good enough.
Got it. And does this include God-Shaped Hole, Gig Economy?
Yes, and the stories are
okay, great. Yeah,
that I published them, which I thought was a fun way to do it because it kind of traced my own journey through the space.
Yeah. Oh, I think linear is the way to go with these things, because you can see the voice kind of develop over time. But anyway, I will look forward to that. Yeah. Just
because I know our listeners will be interested, when does and probably many of them already know the next round of Passage Prize? When is that coming up?
I mean, I think it's a once-a-year event. So my guess, and we don't have anything finalized yet, is that you could start writing now. Nothing is stopping you, but I think the submissions will open probably towards the end of the year, and I think it'll probably occur on a similar time frame to the one that we just saw. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, just such like a great galvanizing force for the DR.
The brief would be a little bit different, though. So the theme this year was Escape from the Longhouse, or something like to that effect. And not everyone respected the brief, and not everyone has to. But we're going to probably go in a slightly different direction for the theme of the second work. Still similar, still sympathetic, but a little bit different emphasis is what I think.
Got it.
Interesting.
Well, we will certainly look forward to that, as I'm sure many of our listeners will as well. I think we're pretty much coming up to the end here. Unless, Dan, you have anything else to add?
No, I'm all good here. But thank you for coming on, Zero. This has been great.
Always an honor. Like I've told this to other people, but there is a part of me that really doesn't understand why anyone wants to interview me, and is always sort of flattered to be invited. So thank you.
No, it's been a great hour. I don't even know how long we went, but it's been a great episode, and I think we covered a lot of really interesting themes, and I'm really excited to get this one out there.